Hi there, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Thursday, July 24th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with New York reporter Luke Tress. Hey, Luke, how are you?
Hey, Jessica, I'm good.
Glad to hear it. It is day 657 of the war. The Israeli government is reviewing the latest Hamas response to the ceasefire proposal, as U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff hopes to travel to Doha this week to close the hostage deal. Meanwhile, Columbia University reached a $200 million settlement with the Trump administration over campus anti-Semitism and will see its U.S. federal funding restored to the university. We'll talk about other aspects of anti-Semitism in New York, including a new task force put together by Mayor Eric Adams, as well as the vandalization of a U.S. representative's New York office because of her vote on an Israeli defensive matter, and the origins of anti-Zionist slogans in the Soviet Union. Stay with us. Okay, so Luke, let's start with your piece about New York City Mayor Eric Adams' Anti-Semitism Task Force. This is something you've been working up to in your coverage, but it held its inaugural meeting late last week. And Adams, you mentioned in your story that he also launched the Office to Combat Anti-Semitism as the city grapples with this very obvious surge in anti-Semitic hate crimes since October 7th, 2023. Now, you were there, I think, at the outset of the meeting. Tell us what you were seeing and hearing there.
Yeah, so Adams started this office in May to combat anti-Semitism. So Jews are targeted in hate crimes more than all other groups combined in New York City. More than 340 incidents reported to police last year. So they were seen as this real need to start this office specifically for anti-Semitism, even though there's a hate crimes unit also in the city government, but this is really for anti-Semitism specifically. So it started in May. The person leading it, his name is Moshe Davis. He was one of Adams's Jewish liaisons and then took over this task force. So since May, he's been meeting with different city agencies. They're really taking a citywide approach to this. So at this meeting, there were city agencies you would expect, like the NYPD and the Human Rights Commission. And then there was also ones that don't seem that relevant, like the Parks Department and Small Business Services. And what they explained to me is they're taking this comprehensive approach. So something like the Parks Department, they can help with anti-Semitism because they said around 4% of hate crimes happen in parks. So the Parks Department could do something like identifying swastikas more quickly and removing them quickly. So that's kind of an example of how they're bringing in all these different city agencies to help in this effort to tamp down on anti-Semitism.
You wrote that they closed the rest of the meeting to press. What is your expectation going forward on covering this task force? And do you really see your coverage, which of course does focus a lot on anti-Semitism in the New York City area, do you see your coverage changing in any way as a result of the establishment of the task force? Or, keep on covering things as they unfold?
The task force, it's still early. Like this meeting was kind of it taking starting to take shape for the first time. So it's like we don't know what kind of impact it will have yet. Like for example, a lot of these city agencies, they're not involved in Jewish issues, and the staff is not Jewish. So they're using the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. So part of the meeting was just explaining them that definition because there can be some gray areas. So the IRA definition, it covers a lot of instances of anti-Semitism, but the controversial one is some forms of Israel criticism are covered. So if you say Jews shouldn't have the right to a state, that's considered anti-Semitism under this definition, but it can be hard to distinguish in some of these gray areas. So part of the meeting was just explaining to people who are not familiar with the issue what exactly applies. So it's still early to see what kind of impact this will have. Going forward, they're going to keep having one-on-one meetings with these agencies, and they're going to convene the whole group every quarter or so, they told me.
And of course, there is a mayoral election in November. So what does that ultimately mean, in your opinion, for something like an anti-Semitism task force. It would not seem that Mamdani, who is the frontrunner in the election, is going to be all that interested in this. Thoughts?
Yeah, this is one of several things Adams has done lately that appeal to the mainstream Jewish community. He adopted IRA for the city government. He set up a business council to build business ties with Israel between New York City. He's been feuding with the city comptroller, Brad Lander, who is a Jewish ally of Mamdani, about the city's investments in Israel. So it's one of several things he's doing, and like there is the legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism. Then there's also the political angle, because Adams is running against Mamdani and Cuomo, who's also playing for the Jewish vote. So yeah, it's part of this bigger political picture, and they told me there's going to be more anti-Semitism measures coming down the pipe. Like Randy Mastro, who's the mayor's first deputy mayor, told me they're looking at anti-masking legislation to rein in anti-Israel protesters. So there's going to be more measures like this happening as the election gets closer. The general election's in November.
Okay. Let's turn for a second to sort of the other side of anti-Semitism as it's debated, but anti-Israel, anti-Zionism. You wrote about anti-Israel activists in New York who had vandalized the Bronx office of Democratic U.S. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, who is one of Israel's leading critics in Congress. I'll also mention one other sort of similar instance. Federal prosecutors on Monday, you wrote that they charged a pro-Palestine activist with torching 11 NYPD vehicles last month. Let's break it down to both of them. Tell us about that vandalism charge and what it actually means in terms of the broader context.
On Monday, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's office in the Bronx was splattered with red paint that looks like blood, and a sign was hung on the grate in front of the office that said AOC funds genocide in Gaza. And it's apparently a response to AOC. She voted against in Congress. She voted against an amendment to cut funding for Israeli air defenses for Iron Dome. And she said it was cutting defensive weapons but not cutting offensive weapons. It was sponsored by Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a far right representative. So she defended voting against it, but the far left of the anti-Israel protest movement is upset at her for it, and
is upset at AOC.
Upset at AOC, yeah. And this has happened with her in the past. She was in the Democratic Socialists of America, who got upset with her after she hosted an anti-Semitism panel last year. I was at a protest or at a campaign rally last year. She was rallying for Jamal Bowman, who was running for re-election, and there was a big crowd of anti-Israel protesters there who were upset at her for backing Biden because they saw him as supporting Israel too much. So it's been an ongoing thing where AOC is one of Israel's leading critics in Congress, but the far left has also been protesting her pretty consistently for what they see as being too supportive of Israel.
And what did she come out and say about the vandalism and about the fact that it related to this vote in which, in essence, she does seem to be supporting Israel, at least in part, in that vote, in that she was supporting funding for the Iron Dome? What did she have to say?
She said, I mean, first of all, this amendment passed by 422 votes to 6. So it wasn't like it was a close.
Right. And that she was making the difference there.
If she voted against it, it wouldn't have mattered. She said she's against civilian casualties, and this was only focused on defensive weapons, and her focus is on halting offensive weapons used by Israel. And she said something like, my record on Palestine is clear. Also, one of her campaign managers said later that she had been getting death threats about this, and they're talking about security measures. So they're taking it very seriously. So that's where she stands on this so far. And the other thing I'll add is this is the latest in a series of similar vandalizations of Congress people in New York. Like at least 5 Congress people's offices have been vandalized in New York City and around the city due to their perceived support for Israel, both Jewish and non-Jewish, Republican and Democrat. So it's been an ongoing issue with these anti-Israel activists.
Okay. And one that I imagine we'll keep finding and seeing as we go on. Okay. So then, related, unrelated, somewhat, the federal prosecution that charged a pro-Palestinian activist, Jackie McRae, who torched 11 NYPD vehicles last month. To me, as I'm reading about it, it seems to be part of this overall crackdown. Tell us about it and tell us how you see it in the scope of all of this.
Yeah, Jackie McRae, he's 21. He's from New Jersey. He turned himself in for allegedly lighting 11 police vehicles on fire in Brooklyn last month, causing $800,000 in damage. Police were looking for him for a few weeks. They had identified him already, and they said he was very active in the pro-Palestinian protest movement. Although this vandalism, I believe, was part of anti-immigration protests, but there's a big overlap between these protest groups. McRae was also vandalized. He has a history of arrests at protests, both anti-Israel and other protests. Like he also damaged a statue during protests at Columbia last year. One of the things that really stood out to me about this, though, was anti-Israel groups have rallied behind him. There were anti-Israel activists in Kafias at his court hearing. They're releasing public statements for him, including anti-Israel activists at Columbia. And we've seen this before. Like, for instance, a few weeks ago, anti-Israel protester named Tarek Bazruk, he pleaded guilty to assaulting Jewish people, and these same protest groups came out and supported him. They've kind of positioned these people as heroes and advocated for them. So it's become a trend where they're supporting people from their movement, no matter what crimes they are accused of or admitted to.
Okay. All right. Let's leave that piece of it for the moment. We're going to take a quick break. When we're back, we're going to talk about this really interesting piece you have about slogans about Zionism as genocide and how they have roots in the Soviet Union. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Stay with us. Okay. So I'm very curious to hear how you came about this story. Again, you're looking at the slogans of anti-Zionism and surprisingly, at least to me, how they surfaced in New York in 2023, but they have roots in the Soviet Union. You spoke with a scholar who's researched this. But yeah, first let's talk about how did you come by this story? What were the roots for you?
The scholar's name is Isabella Tabarovsky. She's been covering this and writing about it for a while, and I was familiar with her work, but didn't get around to covering it. And it came up now because of Mamdani's win in the Democratic primary. It really brought far left socialist anti-Zionism to the forefront. So I thought it was a good time to get into this topic and explain where some of the roots of this rhetoric came from.
Okay. So let's just to go into it a little bit. You're describing some of the slogans and how they accuse Israel of white supremacy, of apartheid. They decry U.S. funding for Israel. And like, as you said, right, they are gaining prominence with Zohran Mamdani, the mayoral candidate for New York. So tell us how Isabella Tabarovsky, how she came to this. Again, what are the roots of these symbols in the Soviet Union?
Tabarovsky, she grew up in the Soviet Union. She moved to the US in the 80s when she was about 19. And she has worked in Russian analysis and history for her whole career, at different think tanks and in academia. And then in around 2008, she saw a campus protest, a leftist anti-Israel campus protest. And the signs there said, Zionism is racism, Israel is an apartheid state. These slogans we've become pretty familiar with. And it set off a light bulb for her because she immediately recognized these slogans as something from the Soviet Union from when she was younger. And I think to us, we're used to seeing a lot of these slogans now, and it seems obvious. Like Zionism is race, Zionism is genocide. It's kind of like the air we breathe and like seeing this movement. But it's not obvious that people would use this specific language to protest Israel. There's many ways to protest Israel, many ways to criticize Israel, but on the left, there's these specific phrases that come up a lot, like equating Israel with imperialism and genocide and apartheid. And so she started digging about how these Soviet slogans came up in America. Her argument is the Soviet Union was always anti-Zionist. For example, in the 1940s, Israel was aligned with the West, and the Soviet Union was aligned with the Arab states. But she argues the anti-Zionist movement in the Soviet Union took off with the Six-Day War. So the Soviets were supporting Egypt. Before the war, they were sure that the Egyptians would win. They had poured huge sums of money into Egypt's military. And then Israel smashed the Egyptian armies and the Arab armies in the war. And the Soviets were looking for a reason for this. Like, first, it created a crisis in their own image because their allies had lost. And they were looking around for a reason for this. And what they saw, they looked to the US, which was their opponent. The US was not supporting Israel at the time, but they looked to the US. They saw Jews, pro-Israel Jews in powerful places, in the media, in politics. And at the same time, the Six-Day War started awakening this Soviet Jewish movement, the refuseniks who wanted to immigrate to Israel. And American Jews were supporting them. It was a big movement in America to support the Soviet Jews. So the Soviets started to see Zionism as kind of this enemy ideology. And they created this huge propaganda effort, hundreds of books and thousands of articles and radio broadcasts, and pumping this out all over. And they would host these conferences where they brought third world and Soviet bloc activists and academics together with people from the West who were sympathetic. And these groups all got to know each other, and then the Western academics go back to the West and they bring the ideology home with them. And it's been, Tabarovsky argues it's been percolating on the West since then, and that's how it's ended up in leftist circles in the US today.
Interesting. So, but of course, the activists of today have no sense of that connection. One would assume it's just essentially developed as the language that's used in anti-Zionism, in anti-Semitism. Does she see any other more current connection, either to the Soviet Union or to the activists in the US?
I don't think most of the activists today are aware of this, and she says this too. It's become kind of the default stance on a lot of the left. She argues, which I think is also accurate. And it's also not to discount that a lot of anti-Israel people in the West are genuinely upset about Gaza and feel for the tragedy of the Palestinians. It's not to discount that either. It's just this specific language that's being used has continued until today. You see this in groups like the Democratic Socialists of America in New York and the US today. Anti-Israel activism is one of the DSA's planks. It doesn't concern itself that much with other foreign conflicts. And besides this specific language they use, there's also just why of all the global conflicts is so much of the left fixated on the Israeli conflict? Like, there's oppressive regimes all over the world. There's worse conflicts in the world in recent years. So I think it's both the language and it's this kind of fixation on this conflict on the left when most other international conflicts are not that much of an issue.
Right. And don't tend to get the same kind of attention either. Right. Okay. Well, that kind of brings us back to where we started this whole podcast. So thanks for bringing it full circle, Luke.
Yep. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for listening to the Times Visual's Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have, you can always email us, podcast@timesvisual.com. And of course, feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care, be well. We'll see you soon.